This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And joining me at the table today is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Well, it's good to see you again, Sam.
It's good to see you, Richard. You'll have to pardon my voice. I've been a bit under the weather. I'm sure it's nothing to do with
two kids
and flying back and forth across the Atlantic.
From Portugal, Spain.
Yeah, Portugal and Spain. We were there for a week and
with two preschoolers.
Yeah,
that sounds like a good time.
A 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. It was. We had a great time, but you know that all that travel can kind of catch up to you.
I know how that works.
It certainly has this week. So again, for all those listening, apologies. I'll try and make my interjections brief at this podcast today.
I'll cover for you this week, Sam.
Well, I really appreciate that, Richard. I thought that maybe this week you could do the bulk of the talking, and I'll just listen attentively
and admiringly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So, with that being said, Richard, you've got your Bible open here, and we're gonna dive in.
One of us needs to read it.
Well, yeah. Well, I thought it'd be best if you did. We're going to dive into the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
It's a well-known prayer.
It is, and most of us in church have grown up hearing it, reciting it, and but you know, when Jesus says, "Here's something, I'm going to give you a model, something that you ought to do every day," that's worth really leaning into a little bit. And as you know, there's a lot of times that we're familiar with something in the Bible, but you can always lean in closer and take a closer look. And so,
well, I think often that familiarity, I think, causes us to miss things about it.
And especially if you've memorized it and you just recite it by rote memory, then it just kind of flows off your tongue, but you stop. Your brain disengages. You don't need to actually think about it. You just remember what comes next. And so I think it's great to memorize stuff. But you want to be careful that once you memorize it, you don't just assume you know it because you can recite it. You can recite lots of things you really don't understand. So I want to look just in Matthew chapter 6, and interestingly, verse 5, Jesus kind of gets into prayer, and he starts off by saying, "Whenever you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites." And I think that's interesting, that because Jesus typically is a pretty positive person, and so he'll often just tell you truth that's good to do. But it's a little interesting to me that when he talks about prayer, he begins negatively and says, "Okay, we're going to talk about prayer. Here's what you should not do." Kind of interesting, and I think the only reason he would have done that is if he knew full well that these people had been bombarded, had been immersed in bad praying. And you might say, well, isn't any prayer better than no prayer? I mean, I might not really give a lot of thought to my prayer life, but a little, whatever I do is probably better than nothing. And yet, Jesus actually said, there's some ways I don't want you to pray. Don't do that. And so obviously bad praying is, he'd rather maybe you didn't pray than you did it poorly or incorrectly. And so I think it perhaps ought to just catch our attention right off the bat to say, not just any praying will do. Not just any praying is acceptable to God. And so he says, don't be like the hypocrites, because they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by people. So I think if you were to kind of summarize their problem, it is they're praying to the wrong audience. They've got the wrong audience in mind when they pray. They're not really praying thinking, what's God going to think about what I'm saying? They're more concerned, what will people think about what I'm saying? And Sam, you and I both know that there's times when we hear public praying in churches and other places where you can kind of wonder, who exactly are they talking to right now? Because I don't think that they're actually talking to God. I don't think God needs to know that there's a potluck right after the service today. Or the classic at the end of the sermon, you sort of finish off your sermon within your prayer. Yeah, and you're kind of exhorting the people. Now, I think a public prayer should involve the people listening. You can pray on their behalf. You can pray for God to do things in the lives of those who are listening. That can be very powerful. But a lot of times when someone's praying, if I ever had the nerve, I think I might say, "Hey, I thought we were talking to God. Do I need to keep my eyes closed while you're talking to me?" And so I think there are times where I think it's maybe a good question just to ask. So who am I actually talking to right now?
Yeah.
Because when you pray a prayer, maybe you're going to start your leadership team meeting off with prayer, your staff meeting. That's great. You're going to close the meeting in prayer. Good. And you should pray with the people in mind as far as praying for God to do things in their life and thanking God for things. But I think Jesus just heard a lot of praying where they really weren't talking to God at all.
Yeah.
And he just says, don't do that. He says, truly, I tell you, they have their reward. And it's interesting in this section how much he talks about reward.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is there is a reward for praying. There in the sense of reward that there's something that you'll get in return. But he says if all you really care about is impressing people, that's it. That's what you're going to get. You weren't talking to God, so God's not going to give you anything. You were focusing on people, so you're going to get what people can give you.
Yeah. And I think the sad thing is, I think that's what a lot of people want. And then they become satisfied with the reward of having people think they pray really well or whatever it is.
And you wonder, why would you care? Why would you care to impress people with your prayers unless you just want to give the appearance of spirituality, of being mature as a Christian or something? But Jesus is saying what a shallow kind of reward that would be.
Yeah.
And the fact, if you want to appear to be mature, it means you're not mature. You invalidate the very thing you want. And so it says, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine they'll be heard for their many words. So the hypocrites are probably God's people they're phonies. And then he says, and then there's Gentiles that aren't even necessarily Christian, and they just think if you just say a lot of words that it just sounds really impressive. And again, we're not encouraging our listeners to critique people that pray all the time, but I think sometimes people feel a little bit insecure about their prayer life because they can't say a lot of eloquent things, and some prayers, the first 5 minutes are basically wasted words. They're just a bunch of eloquence that don't really mean anything. And Jesus was saying, you don't need all that stuff. You don't need all the flowery language, all the words that don't really mean a whole lot. They sound impressive, but you're not really saying anything. Jesus would just kind of say, skip through all the redundancies and all the flowery language and cut through all that and talk from the heart. And so he lays out a bunch of that. And he says, don't be like them, because your Father knows the things you need before you ask him. And that's interesting. Right before he gives the model prayer, he says, and just remember, before you ever pray, God knows what you need already. So if that's the case, then how does that affect how you pray? Because you don't need to pray to inform God of anything. He already knows, Jesus says. So that must mean that when you're praying for some other reason. It's not to fill God in on what he doesn't know. So it must be for another reason. And and of course there's lots of things that God can accomplish in prayer, but certainly I think it's to facilitate a relationship. He wants you to spend time communing with him. But so focus on him, not on other people, and don't worry about just making sure that you filled him in on all the details. More share your heart with him, and perhaps even more listen to what's on his heart. So then you get to verse 9, and that's where it's called the Lord's Prayer. Probably a better word would be the model prayer. John 17, I think you really ought to be called the Lord's Prayer, because there he's praying from his heart to his Father right before he goes to the cross, and that's heavy-duty, magnificent praying. But it's the Son of God praying to the Father God, and but here you really would say this is really more of a model prayer. And so he starts off and he says, therefore, in other words, okay, so I've told you what not to do. And so therefore, because God knows what you need already, you should pray like this. And that word like is important. He doesn't say you should pray this, because I know people that every time I hear them pray in public, they recite this prayer. I mean, they recite it verbatim, and then they may go on and say other things after that. But I know there's certain traditions where you pray this prayer in a service every week. That's just every week. This is what prayer is. And I know people in some traditions, if you just said, would you just close us in prayer, they'll just start reciting this prayer because they really feel like Jesus meant pray this every day. But there's that word like this, which means this is just a model. It's just a framework. It doesn't mean that he tells you have to pray these exact words every time. But I think what he's trying to put in here is he's trying to say here's the important parts, the things you need to cover in some way. But don't get bogged down in I've got to recite this exact prayer. So it starts off and he says, "Our Father in heaven," or in King James, be "Our Father who art in heaven." And there's lots of things just even in that first phrase. Number one, the very fact that he tells you just bow your head, start talking to God, is actually extraordinary, that you can think that you could be anywhere in the world, maybe down in your basement office, maybe in your car driving to work, and you begin talking, focusing on God, and the God of the universe hears what you're saying. That the mere almost presumption that you, a creature of dust, can just begin thinking thoughts or saying words out loud, and the God who is overseeing 7-8 billion people on the planet is instantly aware of what you're saying. I mean, just that alone, you need to just meditate upon that, the profundity of that reality. But also, it starts off and he says, our Father. Now, you'd think that when he's teaching someone a model prayer, you'd say, my Father, because I'm the one praying. But what's interesting is throughout this whole model prayer, it's all in the plural. It's all forgive us our debts, our Father. And I think in part what Jesus was trying to say is, I know that you have a tendency to be self-centered, self-absorbed, that all your praying, all of your thinking is about you. But when you talk to God, have others in mind. As you pray in the context. Sam, you obviously need to have a prayer life with God, but every time you talk to God, you also have a wife, you got 2 daughters, you've got parents, you've got friends, you've got colleagues, and you take all of those relationships, all those concerns with you every time you pray. So just keep all those in front of you, and don't let prayer become a very self-absorbed, me sort of prayer request. And when he says our Father, of course, I think it's important, especially when you study this prayer, that to realize that when Jesus was speaking, he's probably speaking in Aramaic. He's not speaking in Greek. Now, the Gospel of Matthew was written in Greek, and so it uses Greek words. But I think scholars have said, but when he was saying this, when he was teaching this to his disciples, he's speaking Aramaic. And the Aramaic word would have been Abba, which would be the word for father in Aramaic. And most people say that would have been that's like daddy. That's one of the very first words that children would learn to say. It's interesting how often kids say dada before they say mama, but Abba would have been that word that they would have learned to say early on. And what's interesting about that is that in the Old Testament, Jewish people did not call God Father. They did not pray our Father because it was considered far too presumptuous for you to consider God as your Father.
It's way too familiar.
Yeah, they would say that God is far away. He's above you. He's far greater than you. I think there's about a dozen places in the Old Testament where God is described as a father. He's a father to his people or something, but you would not speak directly to God and call him Father. That would have been there was such reverence that you didn't even really want to use God's name because you didn't want in any way to act irreverently. And so for Jesus, the Son of God, to tell us, yeah, when you talk to God, use a very personal, loving, intimate word that only a child would really use toward a parent that they loved. And for God just to introduce it that way is amazing. And, in the Old Testament, oftentimes when God was addressed, he'd be described as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But here Jesus says, well, he is all those things, but he's also your father. He's not just the father of Billy Graham or Henry Blackaby or Abraham or David. He's your father too. And so pray that way. And so it says our Father, and then it says in heaven. And you have to be careful with that because we tend to think that in heaven means he's far away, that he's way off in the heavens somewhere. So we're having to pray to a God who's listening in from far, far away. But heaven is actually, it's the spirit world. We tend to think, well, if you get in a spaceship and you go right to the end of the universe, and then heaven is after that. But heaven is just the spirit world, and the spirit world, of course, is among us. We're right here. We don't see the spirit world, but it's not far away. There is a spirit world that we inhabit. We're in the physical side of things, but the spirit world is not a great distance away. It's just a different dimension. And so heaven is among us, essentially. It's just that we don't see it. And so I think part of what Jesus is trying to say is he is a father, but he's a heavenly kind of father, a spiritual father. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the Jewish people didn't really want to use a metaphor for God, like calling him father, because some people had kind of jerks for fathers or unknown fathers or distant fathers who disappointed them. And so to call God something like that, you immediately thought about your own experience of fatherhood. And so if you had a bad father, you didn't want to think less of God. But again, it says, but remember, this is a father in heaven. He's not an earthly father. He doesn't have sin. He doesn't disappoint. He's always faithful. So my dad would always say, don't lower what the Bible says about God down to the level of your experience of what the fathers you've known. Understand that he's a father in heaven, which means he's perfect. He's always reliable. He's totally loving. He's totally holy. And so it says so first of all, really focus in as you pray on who it is you're talking to. And sometimes I find myself maybe you're taking a moment to pray, but you're in the midst of a busy day. There's a lot going on, and so you kind of just start praying. And there's times I've had to stop myself and just almost remind myself, now remember who it is I'm talking to. This is my Father in heaven. This is not just a colleague. This is not a staff member that I just need to hurriedly give some instructions to. This is my Father in heaven, and so lay that out. And then the very first request is, hallowed be your name, or your name be honored as holy. Hallowed just means holy, and it's saying, God, I want your name to be holy or considered holy. And of course, there's nothing you can do to make God holy. You can't pray and make him holy. You can't encourage him. God really encourage you to just be as holy as you can be. It's sort of like, well, what am I praying? I mean, he can't be any more holy than he already is. So why would I pray when he's already perfectly holy? Why would I pray that he be more holy? It seems like a waste of breath. But I think what it's saying is the one area that he can be more holy in, that I have any say over, is in my own life. So I think what it's saying is, God, would you demonstrate your holiness in my life? Now you can pray, may you be holy in Washington, D.C. or in the Middle East, but that's fine to pray that. But as you pray daily, what you can pray is, God, demonstrate your holiness in me, in my life. And of course, when I think of that, I think of, well, so how did he do that in the Bible? And you think of someone like Isaiah, who came to worship God, and he might have been saying something like, "Hallowed be your name, God," and then God sort of says, "Well, let me show you how holy I am." And when Isaiah begins to see the holiness of God, it exposes, he doesn't become any more holy. He just reveals to Isaiah how holy he is.
Yeah.
And the next thing you know, Isaiah is saying, "Woe is me, I'm undone." And because God's holiness reveals how unholy Isaiah is and how unholy his mouth is. And immediately he comes to church thinking, "Oh, I'm going to worship God and worship his holiness." And then all of a sudden God demonstrates his holiness to Isaiah, and it totally undoes Isaiah, and he's got to get right. And God cleanses him and addresses his sin and makes him holy. So think about what God did with Isaiah, and then think every time you say, "God, hallowed be your name. May you demonstrate your holiness, God, in my life." Think about what you're asking God to do before you. And Jesus says you ought to pray that every day. So God, every day, would you demonstrate your holiness in my life? Which means, would you expose my sin? Would you bring me face to face with the awesomeness of who you are? And then let me feel the full weight and impact of that. Now, that's a pretty heavy prayer. And to be praying that every day and then waiting for God to do that. And it says then, may your kingdom come. And of course, all through the Gospels, John the Baptist, Jesus, Paul, later, they're all praying about the kingdom of God. It's interesting, he doesn't say, "May your church come." And I mean, Christ loves the church, but he prays for the kingdom, which is the rule of God. And the rule of God, of course, encompasses every church. It encompasses every Christian, every Christian nonprofit. Anywhere on the planet where God's rule is being exercised, that's his kingdom. And of course, there are strongholds. There are strongholds that are holding out against the kingdom, that are resisting his rule. There are areas of darkness that resist the light. And so he is saying every day, "God, may your kingdom be spread into areas that it's not fully in control of right now, where Satan's forces are resisting." And of course, that can also mean, God, in my own life, any area where there's a holdout in my life, where you don't have complete rule, complete authority at this point. Every day, God, I want to see your kingdom expand. And so as I go to work, if I see a colleague that doesn't yet follow you as their Lord, then Lord, I want to pray that your rule would be expanded to that person's life. And if there's places maybe in my community where Satan has a stronghold, God, I'm going to pray every day that you'd bring down that stronghold. I love that when maybe there was a bar or a strip club or something, and it goes bankrupt, and a church buys it, and now the church meets there, and you'd say, well, God's kingdom came there. It used to be a stronghold for evil, and now it's a lighthouse for good. And so every day, when you pray that, God, I want your kingdom to expand, and then you go out into your day with your spiritual eyes open, watching for places where God's kingdom is not yet fully in operation. And then it says, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And again, when you're praying this, the person that you have most control over in that regard is going to be you. So, and when you think about, well, so how is God's will done in heaven? Well, there's not a lot of debates. There's not a secret ballot. Should we or should we not do God's will? When God expresses his will, it's done instantly. It's done joyfully, wholeheartedly. God says, I'm looking for a volunteer to go do this. And every angelic hand is immediately raised and say, I'll go. And so God says, so the same way that my will is done in heaven, that's how I want it done on earth. That's how I want it done in the church you go to, in your family, in you. I want you to be just as zealous and wholeheartedly committed to doing my will as it's done in heaven. And now that's hard to, now if you really mean that, if you understand what he's saying, and then every day you say, God, may I do your will as wholeheartedly as the angels in heaven do. Well, then that's going to expose you if that's not how you're doing His will now.
Yeah.
And so to begin your day, don't pray that prayer and then in your next breath tell your friend you've been really wrestling with God about something He wants you to do. You can't pray this prayer and then wrestle with God about His will. You've just prayed, God, I want to do it as zealously as Gabriel does in heaven. And it says, give us today our daily bread. And that word daily in front of bread is actually a very unusual word. It's almost never used. I think this is the only place in the Bible it's used. And it's one of the only places in the Greek language that it's used. It's a very, very obscure, unique word. And so it's been translated daily. Give us now that can mean give us today's bread. Give us enough bread to eat today so that we don't starve to death. It could mean give us tomorrow's bread. It might assume that you've got your meal today, but tomorrow is uncertain, and saying, God, I'm placing tomorrow into your hands. And of course, bread was the basic staple of families at that time, poor families, and if you had a loaf of bread, you had things covered. You could supplement that, but that loaf of bread is what you've kind of built your meal around. And so maybe he's praying, God, give us the bread for tomorrow. But also some feel like maybe what it's saying is basically not so much daily, but give us sufficient bread. Give us enough bread that we can eat. Not too much, but not too little. Just enough, like Goldilocks, just right. And then some have even said, well, but I can't really imagine just praying to God, just give me just enough and no more, because God has a way of giving us exceedingly abundantly more than we ask for. And so maybe just what it means is that it's more a statement of faith to say, God, I just trust all of my bread needs to you in the future, and I just know you're going to cover it. And so I'm just not going to worry about it. I'm not going to stress about it. And I think there is maybe some of all of that in there to say your fundamental needs, those things that if you don't have any bread to eat the next day, you're going to be up at night concerned about that. But if you just take all those concerns and whatever it is you're concerned about, and you place them in God's hands and say, God, I'm just putting my tomorrow in your hands. I'm not going to spend all night worrying and fretting about tomorrow. I'm putting those concerns in your hands. And then it says in verse 12, and forgive us our debts as we have also have forgiven our debtors. And that it's interesting if you read Luke in the same model prayer, there Luke says, forgive us our sins. And here it is, forgive us our debts. And so you might say, well, why do the two gospel writers use different words there? But interestingly, the Aramaic language, the same word that means debt also can mean sin. And so when Matthew and Luke are taking this Aramaic word, they're having to translate it into Greek. Well, Greek has a word for each one. Greek was a more sophisticated language. You could be more precise with it. So when they're coming to this word, they've got to decide what Jesus meant, because the word he used can mean debt or it can mean sin. Either one, it's both an accurate translation. He used an Aramaic word, and so of course, so these guys write it in Greek, and now our Bibles are translated into English, and so we're a couple languages removed from what Jesus actually said. But I think you can apply it either way. A debt is something that you owe. You haven't done it yet. And so it could be a sin of omission. God, forgive me for what I haven't done yet, what I still owe you. Maybe, God, I promised, I committed, I pledged to do something, I haven't done it yet. So forgive me the debts I have toward you. Or it could be a sin. It's something you have done that you did wrong, and now you're asking God to forgive you. But interestingly, Jesus said, I want you to tie it to how you've treated others, how you've treated people who owe you things or they've sinned against you, and say, God, and that's an interesting prayer. I don't know how, I tell you what, if you want to be kept honest, then turn to pray to God and say, God, don't forgive me any more generously than the level I've forgiven others. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're praying that, you can see how there'll be times where you might want to stop and say, God, let me get back to you on that. I think I need to make a phone call. I need to go call a friend that I'm estranged with right now and do some forgiving, because I don't want you to forgive me the way I've not forgiven someone in my life. And of course, it's an interesting way, because God is a God of grace. And yet God says, but when you're praying, I want you to put your forgiveness on the table of others and be reminded that it's not right for you to ask me to do more for you than you're willing to do for others. You want to be stingy toward others, but you want me to be generous toward you. And so again, you can kind of see how if you kind of go down each of these paths that Jesus is laying out for his disciples, then you realize, okay, now he's meddling here, and there's actually a whole lot more to what I'm praying. And if I were to be serious about each of these requests, I'll tell you what, it would cover a lot of major areas of my life. And lastly, I'll just mention this, and we may just take a whole nother podcast just to unpack this phrase. In fact, maybe we should, Sam. Maybe we'll just next time we'll just talk about verse 13.
I had a suspicion that this may be a two-parter.
Kind of running. We didn't get quite as far as we thought we would, but maybe I think verse 13 it qualifies just for its own podcast.
Well, that's plenty for us to chew on right now.
Yeah,
and appreciate you taking us through this, Richard. And stay tuned for part 2.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.